Hello, ladies and gents, and welcome back to the Humanities class and our unit on the medieval era. So last time we skimmed through some of the ideas and the ideas and the plot points regarding the legends of Arthur. And again, we didn't cover them anywhere near in depth that they deserve to be covered in, or anywhere near in the actual cumulative uh, depth and scope that the legends have. We just looked at some of the most key and iconic ones and sort of tried to get a little bit of a vibe on what the medieval era has to offer, what some of the values were, what some of the sensations or what some of the main tropes of that particular culture may have looked like, or at least the literature from that culture will look like. Now, for this unit, or for this next video in this unit, what we're going to look at is a couple historical elements of the medieval era that are usually overlooked, and like I was hinting at last time, are usually a bit of a shock to people who come to the medieval ages or the medieval era with sort of a, what would you call it? A set of stereotypes, sort of what are essentially just poor myths, misunderstandings about the era. And so I entitled this for my classes the quote unquote dark ages. Those are what we call scary quotes, right? The quotes that are meant to say that the word is not accurate, the word is not real, it's rhetorical. So the Dark Ages. Now, why do we call the medieval era the Dark Ages? Why do we call it the medieval era in general? Well, just as a point of historical understanding, the medieval era, that term medieval, okay, comes from the Renaissance. That's actually the Renaissance, which is the next period in history, technically after the medieval era. It's essentially labeling it, oh, it was this middle point between, the classical era and our era, the productive era. So it is a libel. It is a negative title in some sense. And so is the Dark Ages, right? It's essentially even worse. So what I like to do with my classes is essentially ask some basic questions, just as an opener, about what do you think made the Dark Ages so dark? What was it that was so bad about them? And inevitably, a lot of those points come down to either the living conditions or the general ignorance that pervaded the culture in the world at that time. That's usually what people say. I would like to put forward, and I think most medievalists like to put forward contrary examples to that, and not just contrary examples, because of course we can always find outlier examples in history, but I think what are facts and points about this historical period for the essentially the millennia of time of this period, the several centuries, that act as a complete counter evidence to this particular idea that this period was full of darkness, full of ignorance, and full of just nothing but suffering. Okay, so usually in my class, we begin by just going over the feudal system, right? What is feudalism? How do we understand this? Now, if you're following along with our actual class notes, they'll look like this, the Dark Ages notes, very creatively titled. And we have to label the four structures or the four parts of the feudal structure. So we can just do that really quickly here. So, and there's actually like a more elementary kind of version of it right down there. So feudalism, what is feudalism? Okay, it's a social system, as it says, where peasants exchanged labor and products for protection under nobles who served a monarch. Okay, so social system, peasants serve someone above them, they serve someone above them. Ultimately, we all serve the king. Okay, so at the top of the feudal system is the monarch. It could be a king or it could be a queen, depending on the system, depending on the culture. It could be an emperor. Okay, it's generally going to be a singular ruler, right? That's the smallest group, right? The royal family, the royal figure at the very top. Now, a couple things here. I usually will ask the class, as you can see, well, what's their role in the system? Who do they take orders from? Now, the interesting point here is for the king, if we're referring to medieval Europe, we have a general idea, yeah, king or queen. We know that the role in the system is going to be, as we're going to see, to govern the realm, right? The system, the lords, the knights, the vassals, and the peasants underneath, right? Their role is essentially to act as the king, the leader, the protector of the land, okay, of the realm, the protector of the realm, right? As Game of Thrones has made a very popular title. But the question comes then over here, who do they take orders from? And that's a fun question because the structure of, or in the concept of kingship in this part of the world grows out of, as virtually everything does in this part of the world during this time period, grows out of the Judeo-Christian understanding of the world. And if you look back in the Judeo-Christian text, the Bible, right? How do we see kings being portrayed there? How do we see kings being elected there? Fundamentally, kings are elected, anointed, chosen by some sort of divine means, whether it's God, whether it's God's prophets, whether it's the priests, the bishops, all this kind of stuff. Going back to King Saul and King David, right? It's anointed by God as essentially a shepherd of the realm, the people. That is usually going to be your answer here. The king essentially needs to take orders from God. And how does that actually take place? Like, how do you take orders from God? Well, you can foresee probably some of the main conflicts that are going to begin in the medieval era and then really come to a head in the Renaissance with the Protestant Reformation, which is how do we interpret that? Does that mean that the king has some sort of unique, direct connection with God? Does that mean that the king needs to be guided and helped by like priests and advisors, a la Merlin and the Archbishop in the Arthurian tales? And how does that work when the religion that we are practicing in this part of the world at this particular time is Roman Catholicism, where there is a singular head of the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, and there are multiple monarchs in the country surrounding Rome? How is that going to work? So does that mean that all of the kings and emperors and queens are basically in a position where they need to take orders from the Pope? You can see the complexities here, right? But essentially, what it's going to say, what you would say there is that the king needs to take orders from God or a divine figure in this system, okay? Now, underneath the king are the nobles, okay, the lords. That's basically how you would call it, how you would refer to them. You could say they could take many different titles, whether it's lord, duke, archduke, count, all this kind of stuff. There's a bunch of different nobles in that kind of category. But basically, the people that own like severely large amounts of land underneath the king's rule. Okay. Now, what is their role essentially? It's similar to a viceroy. It's similar to governors in an empire. It's essentially that you are in charge of that particular realm or that particular part of the realm in place of the king. Okay, it's like you're mitigating down the responsibilities of the people or of the king. Right, so the king has responsibility over all of his lords, his managers. They have responsibility over all of the knights underneath them and so on and so forth. So that they're just kind of the next level down in that sense. Who do they take orders from? Obviously the monarch, okay, the king, the queen, the emperor, whoever it might be. Below them, you have the knights. Okay. Now, an interesting thing about a knight, we can talk about this to some length. I laugh because it's a never-ending joke between my friends and I. What actually defines a knight? What is a knight? A knight, ladies and gentlemen, a caballo in Spanish, the caballero, the root of that word means someone who has a horse, essentially, as a horse rider. Now, that essentially means an armored horseman, a military horseman that is armored, that takes his orders from a lord, from a noble, essentially. That's a knight, okay? The term knight, knit, caballero, I can't remember the Latin word to save my life, but yeah, the root there is still horse. It still has horsemanship in its roots. That is a uniquely medieval concept, okay? And the closest equivalent to it would be some of the warriors in like feudal Japan, right? So that's like everyone's favorite comparison, right? Are knights the same as samurai? Fundamentally, no, because the worldview and the culture and the rules, laws, and practices are very different, right? Are very, very unique in this particular culture. So a knight, right? A knight would, yes, have armor. He would have a sword. He would have his horse. He would have to know all the skills, all this kind of stuff. He would be very wealthy, right? He would be the next wealthiest kind of person down the hierarchy from the Lord. Okay, so if the Lord's a billionaire, the knights are going to be like millionaires, close to millionaires at least, right? So what is their essential role? They basically keep order in their province underneath the rule of the Lord, right? So again, you can see that kind of how that just trickles down essentially. So if the Lord has, if we usually, I tell my students, I think of it as like a home. Like I said, if you go home, who has dominion over the entire home? That would be mom and dad, right? If you want to be controversial about it, you say it's dad, right? Dad's the head of the household, or it's mom. Mom's the head of the household. Whoever is the dominant, the monarch there, the king and the queen. Okay, well then who is in charge of the kitchen? Who's in charge of the living room? Well, fundamentally, it is still mom and dad. They are the king, but basically they might allow some of the older siblings, or maybe grandma, to basically, have control over that particular area. Like, you're responsible for this room, you're responsible for that room, keep that room clean, keep that room orderly. And then within there, you might have the middle children, right? The children who are able to kind of go around and play in those rooms and do what they want, but still need to keep it orderly, who are responsible, or who are basically answerable to the one who's above them, who is in turn responsible to the one above them. You can see how this is working here. Now, finally, of course, yeah, and of course, who do the knights take orders from? That would be the lords or the nobles. Who do the peasants take orders from? Well, or who do the peasants? What are their roles essentially? Their role is to essentially, help produce economic growth for their superiors, right? They work the land, they work in the towns, they work in apprenticeships and all this kind of stuff, working their way up through the system if they desire so, if they really want to advance themselves, marry into families so that they can have their family kind of climb the hierarchy of feudalism. And they're essentially responsible, or they are accountable to the knights, right? The knights rule over the peasants, and then above the knights is, of course, the lord. So that's essentially feudalism, okay? Very crude, simplistic, but essentially all you need to understand for feudalism. Now, the next thing we're going to look at here, and it's very, very brief because I'm not going to go through all of it. I usually have you, my students, go through, depending on the assignments, it's 3 different videos. One is Dark Ages, How Dark Were They Really? It's a crash course history by Mr. Jonathan Green, really simple one. In this one, he actually covers some really interesting topics. He covers what did medieval Europe not have that Rome did, right? So Rome has something rather unique about it that the medieval Europe did not have. Feudalism, right? Describe feudalism to me. Describe the figure of Thomas Aquinas. We're going to talk about him in a minute. List the benefits that the Muslim world contributed to the medieval landscape. Now, an interesting point there, of course, is that the Muslim world essentially begins a little bit after the medieval era starts to get going. So you want to remember the general chronology of religions from back during that unit. Christianity begins in the 1st century. So 0 AD, 33 AD, right, when Jesus dies, and then his followers, begin the movement of Christianity. In 476, Rome falls. Christianity is already well established during that time, is the basic religion of the Roman Empire, and has spread throughout all of Europe at that point. Then during the subsequent, 150 years plus after that, it firmly is the dominant religion of Europe, and it has spread throughout that whole known world. Now, when we reach the year 600, like in the 600s, essentially, then you have Islam growing. You have Muhammad spreading Islam throughout the world, or the Mideastern world, and into Africa, and then it starts to come in contact with the European, or the formerly Roman Empire. But at this point, and then we get into the first millennia, the closing of the first millennia, we start to have the conflict with the Crusades and all this kind of stuff. So essentially, by the time the Crusades get going, Islam had already been established for around 400-ish years, and it has established itself as a civilization, as the Mideastern civilization. And so what does it contribute? Okay, because it is a very unique civilization, and it does contribute quite a bit. So Jonathan Green talks about this. Ibn Sina is, of course, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, medieval Islamic philosopher and thinker. And what is it that he brought to the table? Okay, we're going to talk about him in a minute too. The next video that we can choose from is another crash course one, is about the Crusades specifically. How do we have to understand the Crusades? What is it that is important to understand about them? The first question is basically asking, how does Green identify a false conclusion about religion and wars and history? So we talked about this last unit, or 2 units ago, actually. And it's this false idea, one of the first things we can dispel about the medieval era is that it was essentially just a bunch of people running around causing wars, of engaging in wars that were caused by religion. This is inaccurate. Okay, this is an idea that is not accurate for that time, and then to extrapolate from that all wars are caused by religion, or religion does nothing but cause wars. This is also completely inaccurate. Wars are very complex things. The more accurate way, if you want to make such a generalization, is that it's governments that cause wars, not religions. Okay, in order to really kind of dig into that issue, you would need to really kind of comb through quite a few wars, and what you're going to see is that most of them are actually a result of desires for territory, a requirement for, or a desire for resources, expansion, all this kind of stuff. Sometimes the motivation for that expansion in that territory can be involved with religion. Sometimes religion gets involved with already kind of existing wars, and it kind of fuels the process or quells the process of war. So it's a lot more complicated than that. You can't just do this broad stroke and say, "Oh my gosh, it's all religion's fault." Nah, not always. It's a little more complex than that, as history always is. He also talks about, yeah, what Muslim groups sparked the Crusades, and what did this additionally spark in 1096 AD. What did Christian leaders call the Crusades, or why did they call it a pilgrimage instead of a holy war? Consider the beliefs of Christianity. Describe how the first crusade concluded. What were the two great kings that fought in the second crusade, and what were they like? Okay, so a lot of interesting questions about the Crusades. Jonathan Green does a really good job explaining that, so go through those questions. And again, consider the assumptions that we make and how we can dispel them with some basic historical facts. Now, the generally and somewhat more interesting kind of broad topic video that I've included here as well is a video by PragerU asking simply, how dark were the Dark Ages? It talks about, yeah, what the global warming had allowed for in Europe. It's essentially going to help the civilization grow through interesting means. So look into that. The second question here is asking, with a big misconception regarding medieval beliefs about the shape of the earth. I'll tell you that right now. Yeah, the medieval people did not believe the earth was flat. This is it's become such a meme now. But no, guys and gals, the ancient people of the world, all the way back to ancient Greece, as he explains in this video, did not believe the earth was flat. All right, it was well known to be round from a very early period in history. So no, don't usually assume that. Why are depictions of the medieval ages as dreary and dark not accurate? Because, I mean, you could kind of see this, and I didn't do a really good job, but I tried to demonstrate this in our little picture right here, the Dark Ages. If you look at this particular picture, how dark really did they look? This picture here is more of a Romantic era painting, by the way, so it's someone looking back at the Dark Ages. You see the wars, you see these vivid destruction sort of images, but these top ones here give you an initial sort of hint about what the medieval era would have looked like. Not dreary and dark, but vibrant, passionate, full of life, very hustle and bustle, and very full of art, for lack of a better word. The medieval era, like anyone who goes to a Renaissance festival will tell you, is a very vibrant sort of period. You get the cartoonist sort of taste of it there, and it's called Renaissance era, so whatever. But it's essentially the same idea, that no, these periods in history, these 1,000 plus years of history, could not help but be full of vividly beautiful artwork and culture and architecture and all this kind of stuff. And that leads into the last point of the video here, which is that what are some of the things that were contributed to us, that we owe to the medieval ages? I'll give you some of them, and I like to really illustrate this to my students early on, especially as we move into the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment later on. One of the major things we have to thank the medieval era for are colleges, our schools as we understand them now. So if you're going to college, that's basically the result of the medieval period. The earliest colleges, I think it was in, I always get it mixed up, is it 800s or the 1100s, somewhere in there, in France, I think. But these colleges, essentially, these ancient colleges, which are still around today, like Oxford and Cambridge, were developed by the medieval people. They were very interested. They were deeply interested in education. They wanted people to be educated in like the triumvirate, right? The triumvirate of rhetoric, and how they want you to understand logic and reason and articulation and writing and all this good stuff. But traditionally, what you would learn in colleges was something that is akin to law. You would learn to be a lawyer. You would learn theology, deep theology and philosophy. And you would also learn the equivalent of what then was medicine. So we had hospitals as early as I think it's 8 or 600 AD. We had hospitals and monasteries. It's another big misconception that we have, is that the medieval religious institutions were somehow anti-science or anti-medicine. Not at all. They absolutely were deeply interested in whether it was herbology, astrology, or something of the kind associated with the natural sciences and natural philosophy. So no, they loved it. And my kind of literary parallel to that is the figure of Merlinus in the Arthurian legends. He's a pagan figure. He's very clearly a very natural kind of druidish sort of figure, and yet he is a friend of the church. The church is deeply interested in all the things that he can offer and he can do. So, for instance, and this is another good example, if you go and research a figure like Hildegard von Bingen. Hildegard von Bingen was a Catholic nun, and she was a philosopher, she was a poet, she was a musician, and she was an herbalist, essentially. She was a healer. And she was entirely welcomed, entirely loved in the medieval era. So that, like, these little details from history kind of blow um, the stereotypes that we have about the medieval era out of the water, right? That's a woman who is in the church, and she is better educated, essentially, and more accomplished than most people today. It's insane, and she was celebrated for it. And her music is still available. Go on YouTube, look up Hildegard von Bingen's music. It's still there. It's very beautiful. So, a huge place of education and enrichment in this sense. In terms of by the way, in terms of the sexism accusation, right? That there's an interesting. This is a whole other like video that we could do, a whole other place of research for my students. But the role of women throughout history can be essentially undulating, is what I usually tell them. It undulates, right? Cultures have different approaches and different affections and disaffections towards women. So the medieval era, at least from a cultural perspective, valued women enough to essentially, and it couldn't help but do so because of its Catholic roots. Catholicism, for all of the ways that we criticize it nowadays, from our more modern perspective, held up women as central figures. We're going to talk about that more in our next video when we cover Dante. But when you look at these examples and you look at the cultural developments that this era has handed down to us, you see that these general libels, oh, they were completely sexist, or oh, they were completely anti-science, or they were completely, super repressive and they didn't want any education, or all this kind of stuff. It's just not, it's not accurate at all. And for my Monty Python fans, I have to always say, the witch thing. Witchcraft was actually, the accusation of witchcraft was actually outlawed during the medieval era. They very quickly saw what the Salem people in several hundred years later did not see. They quickly saw that everyone was going to be accusing everybody of witchcraft. So they just said, no, this is BS. You can't do that. We know what you're doing. From a religious perspective, they actually also disavowed the existence of witches. They said, no, they can't. You can't, because they basically said, oh, that's implying that you can get powers from demons and other spirits. And like, no, that's not possible. So they in some ways were a little bit ahead of the ball from the people who were going to come down in the later centuries. Architecture is another thing that this particular video points out. Yeah, the medieval architecture is obscenely gorgeous and ornate. I mean, you go into whether it's a medieval cathedral, a Renaissance cathedral, something of the same era, the complexity, the ornateness, the time that it had taken to create these buildings, hundreds of years, essentially generations of years, is insane, is absolutely insane. Nothing we have created to this day comes close to that. I know, and I bemoan this. I unapologetically, obviously, I love the medieval artwork. And I bemoan the fact every time I go into a major city in the United States, it's trash. It's like the architecture is just garbage. It's trash. It's just some, spasm and ugliness from the modern era, compared to these absolutely like just towering pieces of artwork that you can't help but want to feel enriched, or that you feel enriched in. Okay, so architecture is a huge one as well. He focuses on art in general. I won't go into that in too much detail, but yeah, the artwork, whether it's visual, whether it's music, whether it's literary, it's all there, right? The complexity of artwork in this particular area is insane and is widespread. So as we're going to see again in Dante, so stay tuned for that. He also focuses on free associations and government and all that kind of stuff. There are some governmental, some forms of government that are essentially, or features of government, I should say, that are essentially products of the medieval era. So take a look at those, write down what you think here, and give examples from each of the four categories. I kind of just rambled a few of them for you there. Okay, so if you're following along with the notes, that's those. Now, the actual reading that we're going to do for today is this section on medieval philosophers. And what I've done for us here is I've taken a passage from what is probably, or who are probably, the most famous philosophers from the three world religions, the three major world religions of this era in this particular geographical location. So Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And we're going to take a look at them and just answer some of the questions about them. We're going to kind of comment on what we can see from these particular passages. Okay, so let's follow along real quick. The first one we're going to do is from this gentleman named Maimonides. His full name is Moses Maimonides, right? So Maimonides is very typically understood as the most celebrated, most famous, the most kind of beloved medieval Jewish philosopher. So let's see what he says. It's his oath to God. He says, "The eternal providence has appointed me to watch over the life and health of thy creatures. May the love of my art actuate me at all time. May neither avarice nor miserliness, nor thirst for glory or for the great reputation engage my mind. For the enemies of truth and philanthropy could easily deceive me and make me forgetful of my lofty aim of doing good to thy children. May I never see in the patient anything but a fellow creature in pain. Grant me the strength, time, and opportunity always to correct what I have acquired, always to extend its domain. For knowledge is immense, and the spirit of man can extend indefinitely to enrich itself daily with new requirements. Today, he can discover his errors of yesterday and tomorrow. He can obtain a new light on what he thinks himself sure of today. O God, thou hast appointed me to watch over the life and death of thy creatures. Here am I ready for my vocation, and now I turn unto my calling." Okay, so you can see clearly here, this oath is geared towards someone of learning, someone of development, someone of medicine, all this kind of stuff. It's very beautifully written. As you can see, its values that it's expressing very clearly, I think, would be something that we're in line with even to today, that we want to be humble, ever learning, ever open, very patient-centered sort of care. So great stuff from Maimonides. A couple questions here. The author's purpose in the first sentence describes him as what? His establishment of regret, concerned, responsibility, hopes. Well, let's take a look. The eternal providence has appointed me to watch over the life and health of thy creatures. It's responsibility. He's saying we have a responsibility as doctors, as physicians, as teachers, as all these kind of things to care for others, essentially. Very, very much a noble sentiment right there. Number two. In his second sentence, Maimonides is expressing that he what? May the love for my art actuate me at all time. May neither avarice or miserliness, I can never say that, miserliness, nor thirst for glory or for a great reputation engage my mind. Okay, what is he saying here? He never wants basically to forget his duty. He never wants to forget his duty. My duty is to help people. It's not for reputation. It's not for gain. It's not to think that I'm, essentially just in it for the money, right? That's what he's looking for. Now, avarice, in its context is likely just means greed, by the way. Just a simple little vocab word there, greed, avarice. Maimonides would most likely characterize human beings as what? It's very clearly fellow creatures of God. Okay, so it's not sick creatures that are weak, right? He is not going to demean his patients, right? They are fellow creatures in pain. They are not just sick things, essentially. He's not dehumanizing them. Groups that should be fighting each other? No, not at all. Okay, that's violent. Not synchronistic with basic compassion ideas here. Things that God loves less than him? No, absolutely not. He is not adopting any sort of idea that if you're sick, that means that God's punishing you. No way. They are fellow creatures of God who are afflicted just as we all are afflicted in this fallen, tragic world. Okay, again, you see what we saw in the Judeo-Christian belief system working itself out. Notice, working itself out hundreds of years later here. You see how deeply those ideas have kind of permeated this particular culture. And that brings up another point, by the way, guys, is that Maimonides absolutely would have read the New Testament. He would have read the Quran, probably. He would have been very familiar with these other religious ideas in the world. And so would Ibn Sina, and so would Thomas Aquinas. They all basically were reading each other's faiths. So again, the sophistication of these thinkers, of these religious people during this period was very, very high. Might be even higher than some of us at this particular time in history. So again, I like to, whether it's the people who were able to memorize the entire Old Testament, the people who could memorize all of Homer, or whatever, whatever it is, whatever example it is, or these guys here, we don't want to have chronological snobbery. We don't want to think that people in an older era were completely ignorant in comparison to us. No, they were not. They were just as intelligent as we are, had just as much intellectual capacity as we do. The only difference between us and them is that we have more access to knowledge now. We have more technology and more access to more knowledge than they did. But, it's a wonderful what if. What if Thomas Aquinas, what if Ibn Sina, what if Maimonides were alive today? What would they be able to do? They would probably be at the heads of academia. They would be at the heads and the forefront of science, of education, of philosophy, of religion, of all these kind of things. These were what you would call polymaths, polymathematical people. They engaged in a poly sort of relationship with all the sciences, with all of the forms of learning, whether it was religion, whether it was philosophy, whether it was, literature, arts, education, medicine, physics, what we understand as natural sciences, all of those things. They wanted it all, okay? So Ibn Sina, this is his commentary on medicine. So we have our Muslim thinker here from the Muslim world. He writes, medicine considers the human body as to the means by which it is cured and by which it is driven away from health. The knowledge of anything, since all things have causes rather, is not acquired or complete unless it is known by its causes. Therefore, in medicine, we ought to know the causes of sickness and health. And because health and sickness and their causes are sometimes manifest and sometimes hidden and not to be comprehended except by the study of symptoms, we must also study the symptoms of health and disease. Now, it is established in the sciences that no knowledge is acquired save through the study of its causes and beginnings. If it has had causes and beginnings, nor completed except by knowledge of its accidents and accompanying essentials. Of these causes, there are four kinds: material, effect, formal, and final. So we're getting, again, a little bit more complex language here because it's translated from a very high kind of formal Arabic translation. But we're getting we're getting Ibn Sina's discussions on medicine and how to treat people. So number one, it's asking the author's first sentence serves to what? Introduce and define his topic, explain what he wants to debate, critique other opinions, explain his ignorance. He says, medicine considers the human body as a means by which it is cured and by which it is driven away from health, okay? This is very clearly, I think, introduce and define his topic, right? So he's doing a very typical thing here that philosophers, thinkers, students, anyone discussing an issue should do, which is define your topic, right? Give us a clear understanding and definition of what you're talking about here so we know what you're talking about moving forward. So good job, Ibn Sina. Number two, the passage from Ibn Sina is most likely from a period of history when what? When Islam was preparing for war with Christianity, nah. When Muslims were preparing to convert, nah. Islam was researching medicine. Muslims were condemning the use of medicine. It's very clearly when Islam was researching medicine, which it was. The high medieval era had a golden era within the Muslim world where they very much were extremely interested and adept at the use of medicine. Okay, so fantastic stuff. The passage from Ibn Sina would most likely be used to support which conclusion? Important thing here. Medieval Islamic world was severely underdeveloped. Absolutely not. Absolutely not. B, the Crusades caused a serious need for medical research. Yeah, possibly, but not really. Not really good use of support. This would not really support that all that well because there's no connection between the Crusades here. The medieval Islamic world was interested in developing medicine. Yeah, that makes total sense. The medieval Muslim world was suffering from a plague. Possibly, again, but there's no mention of a plague here. There's no mention of why why Ibn Sina is interested in medicine other than just that he is. So I think it's obviously C. The medieval Islamic world was very interested in developing its understanding of medicine. So I like both of those examples as medical examples right there, again, to dispel this notion, whether you're atheistic, whether you're secularist, whether you're agnostic, whether you're Christian, Jew, Muslim, whatever, dispel with this idea that the medieval religious world was anti-science, was anti-medicine. Completely false. There was no difference, and we're going to see this even more so in the Enlightenment and in the Renaissance. There just was no distinction, ladies and gentlemen, I shouldn't say distinction, there was no friction between a religious worldview and a scientific endeavor, a scientific understanding. You're going to see, especially as we enter the Enlightenment era, that this notion of a conflict between religion and science is a modern development. It's something that came down quite later. But as far as the majority of religion and science's history, that was not the case. They very much worked in sync and in harmony with each other. Thomas Aquinas. Let's talk about him real quick. Okay. This is from his Summa Theologica, where he discusses a lot of philosophy and theology, essentially. It's his great work of theology. In Article 4, he asks the question, does God exist? He poses an objection. So he's obviously discussing something philosophical that we have discussed in our previous units. And this is his attempt at exploring this particular question of God's existence. Notice what he does here. He begins with an objection, right? So you know that Aquinas, being a Catholic, wants to say, yes, of course, God exists. But what does he start with? He starts with the objection. So that's a fantastic move. He says, no, let me, before really adopting or defending my position, let me deal with the strongest objections that are coming at me before we do anything else. Brilliant argumentative tactic, brilliant way to think, brilliant on all accounts. You, ladies and gentlemen, should adopt the same method. You should, before you defend your position, before you really start to explain what you think, before you really start to commit some intellectual assent or intellectual belief and commitment to something, you should address the biggest objections to it. So for instance, I mean, take that in its political context nowadays. If you are a Democrat, if you want to be a liberal or whatever phrase you want to call it, you should deal with the biggest objections to that particular point of view. Same thing goes if you're a Republican or conservative or whatever. If you want to be pro-life, if you want to be pro-gun, if you want to be, you pick the issue, you pick whatever it is. You need to be intimately involved and intimately aware of what the strongest and best arguments are against what you believe, okay? We see Aquinas doing that here. Just shows you, again, how brilliant and sophisticated of a thinker he was. So let's see what he says. Objection 1. It seems that God does not exist, because if one of two contraries be infinite, the other would altogether be destroyed. But the word God means that he is infinite goodness. If therefore God exists, there would be no evil discoverable, but there is evil in the world, therefore God does not exist. Sounds very familiar to us. That is the atheistic form of the question of the problem of evil, of the question of why is there evil in the world if God is all good and all powerful. Aquinas puts that forward, right? God is all good. He should want no evil. So why is there evil in the world at all? Why is there any perceivable suffering or evil in this world? Objection 2. Further, it is unnecessary to suppose that we can be accounted for by a few explanations. By a few explanations has been produced by many. But it seems that everything we see in the world can be accounted for by other explanations. Supposing God did not exist, for all natural things can be reduced to one explanation, which is nature or science, and all voluntary things can be reduced to one explanation, which is human reason or will. Therefore, there is no need to suppose God's existence. A really sophisticated objection. He is making what is called essentially the scientism claim, which is that science can explain everything. We can understand everything through natural causes. Why bother invoking God at all? We don't need to keep, pushing back the letter and saying, it might have been God, it might have been spirits, it might have been the soul, whatever. We can just say, no, it's science somehow, basically. We just need to figure out more about science. Two pretty strong objections to God's existence. Now, he goes through and he replies to each of them. I'm not, for the sake of time, going to go through all of them. That is, of course, going to be your job if you're following along here. But he replies to them. Okay. And notice he quotes Augustine. He quotes the Bible, right? This kind of, again, shows that this guy is reading a ton. You can kind of just see him in his office with like all the bajillion books in the back. So again, showing you, whether it's Maimonides, Ibn Sina, or Aquinas, how well read these guys are. They have a lot of reading, they have a lot of materials at their disposal, and they're trying to be as educated and as sophisticated as they can be. Okay, so again, I'm not going to go through all of Aquinas' thing. We're just going to do that quick little blippet of him. So that, I think, gives you, at least what I hope, is just a quick little skimming the surface, quick little sample of how enriched these particular cultures were, or this particular culture was, in the sciences, in the fields of philosophy, in all the sorts of humanities and ways we could develop culture. So dispel with the kind of traditional notions of the Dark Ages being a bunch of ignorant, Monty Python people running around looking for witches and ducks and all this kind of stuff. Okay, now that's it for this particular video. The next video that we do, the last one in the medieval era, will be on Dante's Divine Comedy, where we will look in a little bit more detail at the philosophy of the Catholic religion that really was the bedrock of this particular culture, and how they understood the world and how they understood good and evil and God and all this kind of stuff. It's a good one for us to understand moving forward, because we're going to look at a couple more pieces of literature that are deeply influenced by not just the medieval world, but particularly Dante's expression of this medieval world. So stay tuned for that, and we will see you next time. Have a great day in the meantime. Bye.